Hi, Brittany.
So I want to ask a question today, and that question is, do kids have First Amendment rights? So, yeah, it's a tricky one. What do you think, Rachel?
Can kids just say whatever they want? Can they peaceably assemble, meaning hang out with whoever they want? As a mom, I'm going to say no. No rights. You must
That's
do
fair.
what I say.
That's
I'm
fair.
a benevolent dictator, but I know that legally that's probably not the right answer.
Well, and it's a tricky question. So when we talk about rights, it is rights. Like parents, you guys are technically private, right? It's like I'm not calling kids private property, even though technically I think legally it might count as that, but I don't like the way it sounds. But that's a private thing, right? Now the government is a whole different ball game. And when it comes to rights, for actually most of U.S. history, whether or not kids had First Amendment rights was up in the air, and generally the rule was no, they didn't. But here's the cool thing about the Constitution. It doesn't cover everything, right? We talked about how the Bill of Rights, people didn't even think it should have been included because they were like, well, it's a no-brainer the government shouldn't abridge speech. But then it's like you give the government a little room, they'll do it. But even
it doesn't
we
have
say,
the Bill of Rights.
Yep. But it doesn't, even the Bill of Rights doesn't say every single instance where it applies. That's what case law does. So when you have a question of like, okay, well, I think this is free speech, and the government says, no, it's not. They're like, okay, guess what? We're going to the courts. Sometimes it's the Supreme Court even. And they do the final like, nope, this is free speech, or this isn't free speech. And that's how we get like, that's how you know that there's other parts to the First Amendment that maybe aren't written there. It's because there have been lawsuits and the Supreme Court has said, okay, well now this, blah, 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 and that's gone in. That becomes law. That becomes precedent. So that's what's happened with free speech and kids' rights especially. And I want to talk about my favorite case, which is Tinker v. Des Moines. And Tinker, this was during the Vietnam War. And the Tinkers are an interesting family. They had like 5 kids, I think, something along 4 or 5 kids. But they were very involved in the Quaker community. So they were not Quakers. Their dad was a minister. I can't remember. It was a Protestant minister of sorts. But they were very close with the Quaker community. And I don't know how much you guys know about Quakers other than the oatmeal, if you see the little Quaker Oats guy on the oatmeal. But Quakers are very
extreme pacifists.
Extreme pacifists. And we say that word today and it almost sounds like bad, like, oh, he's a pacifist. But pacifist is like, you're very peaceful. The Quakers are very anti-war and very peaceful people. And so the Tinkers were friends with this other family who I think were Quakers also, and they were very into anti-Vietnam War protests. So they were, I think the oldest son of the Tinkers was 15, so not very old, but he was going to protest. There was this big march on like Washington where they were protesting the war, and he was there even. And so he and his friend are like, you know what? We're going to do a peaceful protest at our schools. We're going to wear black armbands that symbolize our, opposition to the Vietnam War. And we're not going to create a fuss. We're not going to, we'll start using what are the blowhorns or whatever they're called. They're not going to make a ruckus, create a ruckus, but they're going to go in and that's going to be their way of protesting the war. And then his little sister said, yeah, I'm going to do it too. And she was 13. But before they could even do it, someone found out. Someone snitched, Rachel. Somebody told the school. So as they were walking into the school the day they were going to, they were stopped and basically said, like, you can't do it. I think they were suspended, but not for very long. And then they didn't stop there. They were like, no, fine. We won't wear the armbands. We're going to dress in all black, though. We're going to dress. You can't tell us that we can't wear all black clothes. We're going to wear all black clothes. And that is still going to be our way of saying we do not agree with this war. They were, again, suspended.
So simple.
It's so simple.
I can't imagine, like in this day and age, if some kid wanted to wear all black, can you imagine that being an issue?
No.
Wow.
But it wasn't what they were going to do. It was why they were doing it. And why, which is worse, right? Because that is their expression.
Yeah.
So the crazy thing is, so they decide like, absolutely not. And their parents were very peaceful, like anti-war people too. And so I think one thing that I really love about the story is that they did have the support of their parents. So much so that their parents helped them legally fight back. So the case goes through the court system because it doesn't just go for a court, for the Supreme Court to hear a case is not just like, oh, they'll hear anything if it keeps losing through the court system. No, in fact, it's easier to get into Harvard than to have a Supreme Court take your case. So the Supreme Court take your case. So it's like a whole thing, right? That's why it's such a big deal. So finally, and usually you have to lose some, right? So you like go to court, maybe win your first round, then the other side appeals, then you go to another court and maybe they win this time and you can go back and forth. I mean, we're talking like sometimes 12 years, sometimes longer before it can even get to the Supreme Court. So
no, so were they even still in school anymore by the time this gets to
theirs
the
wasn't
Supreme
the
Court?
12-year one. They were still in school. I want to say, oh, go on.
Here's another question is how many cases do you think, how many court cases do you think appeal to the Supreme Court without getting heard?
I wish
thousands.
I had that number. I mean, it's 1%. So every year,
1%.
okay, let me see if I have this number because I've had to write about this so many times. Let's see if I can remember it in my head. So they only take at most like 189 cases, like that's on the high end, a year.
Wow.
I think it's
That's all they have
something
time
like
for.
several thousand appeal to the Supreme Court. You apply through something called a writ of certiorari. Nobody can say the word. We call it a writ of cert. That's the nickname. Certiorari. It's so hard to say. Even the attorneys I know can't pronounce it. So writ of cert is what we call it. Writ of cert. And you apply for that petition for a writ of cert. And if your cert is granted, then they will hear your case. So in this case, Tinker, that's the family's last name, eventually it made it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, I need to get the exact quote, but basically what they decided, and this is to paraphrase one of the justices, is he said like a child's right to free speech or a student's right to free speech doesn't stop at like the front of the school gate or something to that extent. So even more so than kids, and this is another important part to this case, it was students. So this case was really important because it was basically that students at school, minors at school, are not somehow immune to constitutional rights because they step onto school property. Like, absolutely not. They still have that right. And this was a really big deal. And this was followed by the Vietnam War era is actually very interesting for so many reasons, culturally, musically, and also First Amendment wise. I think it was a really interesting era because there's always been anti-war movements, but this was like a big one, right? People were always protesting and a lot of students were protesting. And why wouldn't they? A lot of them were going to get drafted. They turned 18.
They were being sent off to fight the war. So, and it wasn't like you had a choice. They drafted you. They forced you to go fight and be in the army and go fight in Vietnam. And for what?
For what?
A lot of people really didn't understand why we were even involved to begin with. Like, what do we care about Vietnam's form of government? Even if communism is bad, shouldn't they be allowed to determine that for themselves? That's a whole other question.
I was going to say, and we need to do that because that was actually one of the areas I spent a lot of time in when I was in college learning about. And that is, like I said, it's interesting because it goes into so many other fields, but First Amendment specifically, because it was like, okay, burning flags. We talked about that in another one. I'm not going to argue. We had that discussion in another one, but that's when you see a lot of this stuff because people were burning their draft cards, burning flags. They were getting very angry and wanted to express themselves. And this is one of them. And it's funny because you hear about what I just said, burning flags and things. And it's like, well, the Tinkers just wanted to wear all black to school. When I grew up, all the kids were emo. We were all wearing all black to school anyway. Like that was just an everyday.
Because the Supreme Court said you could.
Ask your parents what emo is. So yeah, it's really interesting. And so the Supreme Court ruled that students do in fact, and Mary Beth Tinker. I'm so glad that came to me. Mary Beth Tinker was her name, and her brother, I can't remember his name, but they still speak a lot about free speech, and they like go to schools and stuff. And they're older now, obviously, but because this is something that is still really important to them, obviously. And I mean, imagine being 13 and 15 and having a Supreme Court case named after you, and someday two women on a podcast are talking with their audience. I mean, that's just so cool to me. That shows one, how important the kids can change the world too. Like you guys have a lot of power to change the world. Yeah. Maybe not talking back to your moms. We won't start there, but You're allowed to say things.
Question.
Different question. But you're allowed to stand up for things in school that you think are wrong. And I always say the word decorum, which is like doing it respectfully. I do think there's a respectful way to do it. And wearing an armband to me is one of the more respectful things you can do. You're not shouting. You're not even protesting outside. That's just a silent act of protest. So I think Tinker is, go on.
But the schools, like you were saying, the schools can limit speech if it causes substantive disruption.
Yes. And I'm so glad you brought that up because yes.
Very
and
subjective.
So a lot of times with court cases, they'll say like, okay, a kid has a right to free speech if it passes this test. A lot of Supreme Court cases for different things have like a test. They create a test. So Tinker, one of the things it created was that that basically it counted as free speech so long as it did not create a disruption that interfered with another student's right to be there and learn. Right? So that's a really important part. I'm so glad you mentioned that because that is a huge part of this. So if the Tinkers had been coming in and stomping on desks and shouting in people's faces, would that have been free speech? Under the Tinker ruling, no, it probably would not. I mean, I would almost say it emphatically, no, would not have been, right? Because you were disrupting someone else's. But wearing an armband to school or wearing all black to school, that's not, no. Rachel can't be like, well, I can't concentrate, then
because of that black armband, I just can't be in the room with that, or like if you're wearing a political shirt of one side or the other, is that really causing a substantive disruptions? I don't know. Some might argue that, wearing your MAGA hat might be a problem.
Well, and I won't get into this now because this is again, a whole other episode and we're running out of time, but there's actually a lot of cases where people will wear shirts to polls, like when they vote, that aren't even about anything on the ballot. Like this one lady, it just said like, I support the firefighting union, whatever. They had nothing on the ballot about them. And she was arrested and fined.
Arrested?
Yes, because I think it was in Texas. I'm not sure. But they were basically saying extreme. You don't have free speech at the polls. And this was, I think there's been cases like this one that have gone all the way to the Supreme Court. And they're still like argued today, a lot of cases on the lower level. So really interesting what is considered free speech and isn't.
I would say send her home, tell her to change her shirt and come back. But arrested?
I think that's
like
I think that may be what they did. And I think she was probably like, no, this is ridiculous. And maybe that's what happened. I don't remember the specific details, but it's like we've said before, we could have a whole podcast just on free speech because there's so much going on just in that one First Amendment. There's a reason it's so important. There's a reason it's number one. But we will leave it there. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.
Till next time. Bye-bye.